Well, welcome to this month's The Western Mass Democrat. I'm your host, Joseph Gochinski. This month we have State Senator Benjamin Downing from the Berkshire, Hampshire, Franklin District. I'm sure I get that right. Senator Downing, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back, Ben. It's been some time, and since we last had you on, I wanted to get an update on what you've been doing in the Senate and your new committee assignments.
Yeah, well, thanks as always for having me, Joe. It's always fun to be here in Greenfield. You know, it's been a busy couple of years in the Senate as we have tried to work to manage the state's budget through what has been a difficult economic period brought on by the financial collapse that's affected everything from Wall Street straight through to Main Street. So we have done everything in our power to try and reform state government while continuing to provide the services that we need and make sure those services have the support they need, whether that's funding for cities and towns, funding for our courts, funding for our state parks and public safety, public higher education, you name it. All of those areas have been affected by the economic downturn, but we have tried to do everything in our power to continue to provide those services. Some of the reforms that we've worked on have been transportation reform, where we've combined and consolidated agencies to try and make sure that more of our hard-earned tax dollars aren't getting lost in a bureaucracy, but they're getting back to roads and bridges where the dollars need to be invested and where we need to be putting people to work. We've worked on pension reform, which has closed some of the more egregious loopholes, and at the same point hopefully put us on a more financially and fiscally solvent path for years to come. And there's certainly more to do there, but I think we've taken some good steps in the right direction. And we passed ethics reform in a lot of ways to try and get at some of the worst abuses of the system, some made by some of my colleagues, some by others in public office,
Yes.
so that voters, so that taxpayers know that when we go to work, we're going to work with their interest in mind and not our interest in mind. So those are the things that we've been focusing on over the last couple of years. Those are the things that I've been working on over the last couple of years.
Great. A busy time. Speaking of reform, maybe not so much in the reform category, but late last year, I know the Attorney General settled with Verizon and for local phone lines and some reforms from their part. And with the election and everything, it kind of got, we were talking about it before we started taping, it kind of got brushed under the rug, but I wanted you to bring everybody up to speed on actually what that was and how significant it was for Western Mass.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, we also recently got our committee assignments, and I was lucky and happy to be named by the Senate President to be the Senate Chair of the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee. And one of many reasons why I asked to be chair of that committee was any number of different issues I saw when it came to broadband internet access, when it came to how cable companies interacted with our small towns and our regional governments, and when it came to the basic delivery of phone service. I'll tell a brief story. The town of Hancock is partially served by one incumbent provider and in one part of town, and by another incumbent provider in the other part of town. And I was called by the chair of the select board up to town to look at a list that they had of names, and I said, well, Sherman, what are these names? And he said, these are all the people who don't have phone service when it rains a lot. And I said, basic phone service? He said, yeah. So we started to dig down into it. We talked with some of the workers at the company. We talked with the Attorney General's office and the Department of Telecom and Cable. And what we discovered was a basic lack of investment by the phone company had put at risk phone service for people who were living in a community that had no broadband internet access, that had no cell service. So this was their only way to communicate during a storm, say like an ice storm that we had a few years back or something along those lines. So thankfully the Attorney General and the Department of Telecom and Cable looked at this issue throughout Western Massachusetts. And what they realized was that Verizon had failed to make basic investments throughout Western Massachusetts to the infrastructure that they have right now. The telephone network skeleton hadn't been kept up. Under this agreement by the Attorney General and the Department of Telecom and Cable, the phone company has to do that now. So their feet will be held to the fire like they should have for some time.
Absolutely.
And they now will be. And you know, that's a challenge that I don't think grabs headlines too often, but it certainly has a great impact on someone if you don't have cell service, don't have broadband access, and there's something a matter at home, if there's a fire,
if
there's a break-in, any number of different things, absolutely. So I was happy that Attorney General Coakley and the Department of Telecom and Cable stepped in there, and I'm glad that the local officials brought it to me and we were able to work on the issue and get real results. Yeah,
I just kind of getting off on a tangent, I know the administration has talked about getting rid of the tax loophole for telephone poles, and I know the phone companies are quickly on top of that, and I'm not trying to to indict telephone companies here or Verizon or AT&T or anything, but when it means dollars and cents and there's a tax break involved, they seem to know the details in and out. But when we're talking basic service to people, it just things like that simply shouldn't be neglected.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge we face because the big dollars are not in providing basic phone service, right? We know the big dollars now are in cell.
Yes.
The big dollars we know are probably going to be more in the Boston area when it comes to Fios and all these other things that we see advertisements for, but they aren't doing here in Western Massachusetts yet. So we have to be extremely vigilant in making sure that the telecom companies, the cable companies, continue to provide that basic level of service, which they were given significant subsidies to do.
Yes.
And that's something that we need to continue to hold their feet to the fire on. That's actually why I filed a bill along with State Representative Paul Mark, who's been a co-sponsor of it, that says that the phone company, in particular Verizon, cannot sell off part of the state. We've seen them sell off whole states because they deem them not profitable anymore. That's fine. They're private companies now. But I don't want them to be able to say, well, you know what? We don't make a lot of money in those 4 western counties, and they're always complaining about their phone service. So we're going to sell them off. Well, Verizon might not be great to work with all the time. They can be on some things, and they've been responsive on some things. But they certainly are better than the alternative in many cases. So what we need to do is make sure that they're here and that they're providing the high level of service and the same level of service they would to someone if they were in Boston or a suburb of Boston.
Okay. We were talking just a few minutes ago about some of the past legislation. There's 2 things I wanted to bring up and get your comments on. The first was the appeals board for auto insurance. I know there was a bill passed that actually kept the board independent as opposed to letting the insurers decide on appeals, and I just wanted to get your take on that. And of course you mentioned ethics reform, but I'd like you to go just a bit deeper into that and actually kind of, everybody talks about public officials, kind of encapsulate it for public officials, what ethic reform is.
The good thing on the Insurance Appeals Board, I think the good thing was that, number one, we maintained it, and that there is still a process in place by which if someone feels like they were wrongly treated or mistreated by the auto insurance company, they know where to go, and they don't have to simply fight with the company themselves. That there's that independent arbiter that can say, well, yes, this claim should have been filled out, or no, that claim shouldn't have been met, it isn't part of your policy. And I think there was pretty much a unanimous opinion, especially in the Senate, around that. And that's not to say that it was it's not to say that we don't understand why the governor proposed it. The budget's that difficult to deal with at this point, but we thought that there are certain things that you need to keep in place, even if we may not be able to support them at the level that we want to. When it comes to ethics reform, the real thing that we were trying to focus on with ethics reform is not saying that all public officials are bad. They aren't. We know that. But we do know that when some of our colleagues abuse their position for their own gain or abuse their position to harm other individuals, then people rightly are skeptical of all of us, and they say, well, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Now, we could pass any number of different ethics reform bills, and it won't change what's in someone's heart. If someone's going to find a way to abuse a system, they will find a way to abuse even a perfect system. So what we tried to do was to be clear about having a gift ban